Hello guys, I'm Bao and today I'm going to tell you about building a Mars base is a horrible idea. Let's do it. Equals result. Go.
From hostile deserts to lonely islands and the highest mountain.
From hostile deserts to lonely islands and the highest mountains.
Wherever there is space to
Wherever there is space to expand into humans, do so.
and into humans do so. So it's hardly surprising that we're already making preparation
So it's hardly surprising that we're already making preparations
to set foot on Mars
to set foot on Mars and to create the first permanent colony outside of Earth.
and to create the first permanent colony outside of Earth, maybe even terraform another planet.
Maybe even terraform another planet and turn it into a second blue
And
home.
turn it into a second blue home. But wait, before we can get to the
But wait, before we can get to nice future stuff,
nice future stuff, we first have to complete the second phase of colonization,
we need to complete the second phase of colonization.
creating a semi-permanent outpost to
Create a semi-permanent outpost to prepare the ground for a larger human
prepare
presence.
the ground for a larger human presence. But doing so will be gruesome.
But doing so would be gruesome. Even for expansionist species like us, Mars is extreme.
Expansionist species like us, Mars is extreme. At first glance, Mars
At first glance, Mars seems familiar.
seems familiar. Polar ice caps,
Polar ice caps,
large
large
valleys,
valleys, and liquid water under its surface,
water under its surface, and a day barely
and a day barely longer than Earth.
longer than Earth's. The ideal place for us to go.
The ideal place for us to go.
Unfortunately, Mars is actually a cold, radioactive desert where the
But actually, Mars is a cold, radioactive present where the ground is poisonous and breathing is
ground is poisonous and breathing is impossible.
impossible.
Mars is awful.
Mars is awful.
You almost certainly don't want to
You almost certainly don't want to go
go
there.
there. The pioneers doing the hard work on Mars will have
The pioneers doing the hard work on Mars will have an intensely stressful life,
intensely stressful life filled with incredibly challenging
filled with incredibly challenging
problems never encountered before.
never encountered before.
But there are plenty of people willing to do that work,
But there are plenty of people willing to do that work,
and we have the technology to enable them to do it.
and we have the technology to enable them to do it.
For this video, we will assume there have been prior missions to
For this video, we will assume there have been prior missions to Mars
Mars to scout out a good
to scout out a good place for an
place
outpost,
for an outpost, store
store resources and
resources and equipment, and that there's already a moon base
and that's there already a moon base
that serves as a hub for
that serves as a hub for Mars
Mars
missions.
missions. The first major challenge for our outpost
The first major challenge for our
is the
outpost
fact that Mars is very energy.
is the fact that Mars is very energy poor
Because of its distance from the sun,
because of this distance from the sun.
solar power is only 40% as effective
Solar power is only 40% as effective as on
as on
Earth.
Earth. But even this weakened sunlight
Even this weekend sunlight is often obscured for
is
days
often obscured for
For
days
days.
by
by enormous dust storms. Yeah, we just cleaned my desk.
dust storms. Solar power alone will probably not be enough.
Solar power alone would probably not enough.
Alternatives such as wind power and
Alternatives such as wind power and geothermal energy are also unfeasible.
geothermal energy are also unfeasible as there's hardly any
As there are hardly any atmosphere and Mars' interior is much too cold.
atmosphere and Mars's interior is
It's
much too cold. Initially,
nuclear technology might be the only
technology
option.
might be the only option. Since Mars doesn't have easily accessible
Since Mars doesn't have easily accessible to radioactive elements,
the nuclear fuel needs to come from Earth along with
the nuclear fuel needs to come from Earth along with this reactor.
the reactor. If we do set it up, it could power our small outpost for the first few years.
If we do set up, it can power our outpost for the next few years.
Unfortunately, all that energy won't be very useful if we can't
Unfortunately, all that energy would be useful if we can breathe.
breathe. Mars's atmosphere is only 1%
Mars's atmosphere is only 1% as dense as Earth,
as dense as Earth's and mostly made up of
and mostly made of carbon dioxide or CO2.
CO2. So our habitats need to be
So now our habitats need to be pressurized and filled with an artificial atmosphere.
pressurized and filled with an artificial
Yeah,
atmosphere made of nitrogen and oxygen,
oxygen,
which comes with more problems.
which comes with more problems.
Corners and flat walls are weak points. So the habitat
Corners and habitats are weak points, so the habitats will have rounded and smooth shapes.
will have rounded and smooth shapes to handle
the stress of the great pressure differences between the interior and
stress
exterior.
of great pressure differences between the interior and exterior. The airlocks need to be very airtight.
The airlocks need to be very airtight and work perfectly every time.
And work perfectly every time. Without an extensive magnetosphere or a dense
Without an extensive magnetosphere or dense atmosphere,
half of all radiation coming from space
half of all radiation coming from space reaches the ground.
reaches the ground. A person on the surface would be subjected to
A person on surface would be subjected to 50 times the radiation that they would be on
50
Earth.
times the radiation that they would be on Earth. 3 years on the surface of
3 years on the surface of Mars exceed the radiation dose limit.
Mars exceeds the radiation dose limits imposed on NASA
Imposed on NASA astronauts for their entire career.
astronauts for their entire career. This increases cancer
This increases cancer risks significantly.
risks significantly. To prevent that,
To prevent that, we can shield our habitats with a thick layer of frozen
could
CO2
shield our habitats with a thick layer of frozen CO2 that can be harvested directly from the atmosphere,
that can be harvested directly from the atmosphere.
covering the dry ice with a meter of
Covering the dry ice with a meter of dirt would further increase the level of protection.
dirt would further increase the level of protection. Sadly, this means almost no
Sadly, this means almost no window.
windows. From the inside, most living spaces will be windowless tunnels.
From the inside, most living spaces will be windowless tunnels.
From the outside, they'll look like burial mounds.
From the outside, they will like burial mounds.
All of this would still not hold back
All this would still not hold back all the
all the
radiation,
radiation, but reduce it just enough to be survivable for long periods
but reduce it just enough to be survivable for long periods
of
of time.
time. It won't, however, protect anyone who
It won't, however, protect anyone who ventures
ventures
outside.
outside. So, remote-controlled robots will be used for routine work on the surface.
So remote-controlled robots would be used for the routine work on the surface,
While our crew stays inside.
while our crew stays inside.
Staying inside is a good idea for another reason.
Staying inside is a good idea for another reason.
Mars dust.
Mars dust.
It's much finer than dust on Earth, so it
is much finer than dust on Earth, so it can find its way into the gears or electronics of our
It can find
machine.
its way into the gears or electronics of our machines. Because it's also very dry,
Because it's also very dry, it's electrostatically charged,
it's electrostatically charged, sticking to everything,
sticking to everything like
like
space.
spacesuits. It would be impossible to avoid carrying lots of Mars dust into our habitat.
It would be impossible to carry the dust into our habitats and into the lungs of
And into the lungs of our crew. To make this even worse,
To make this even worse, Mars dust, Mars soil is filled with very toxic percolated salts.
Mars's soil is filled with very toxic perchlorate salts.
Perchlorate salts.
Constant exposure could be deadly.
Constant exposure can be deadly.
This problem can still be overcome though.
This problem can be
Spacesuits, for
still
example,
be overcome too. Spacesuits, for example, could be made in a way that they never truly enter the base.
could be made in a way that they never truly enter the base, but stay attached to the outside of the habitats. Okay, great. Now we've safely isolated humans in terms of energy and air and protected
And we have saved the humans and protected them from cancer. We just need to
them
feed
from
them.
cancer. We just need to feed them. Water is easy to come.
Water is easy to come in the settlement is positioned near the Martian
If a
poles.
settlement is positioned near the Martian poles with their thick layers of ice.
With their thick layers of ice. Growing food is a different kind of challenge though.
Growing food is a different kind of challenge though. Mars's soils are
Mars's soils are alkaline
alkaline and lack the vital
and lack of the vital nitrogen compounds that
nitrogen compounds that plants need to grow.
Before we can grow anything, we need to decontaminate the
Before
soil.
we can grow anything, we will have to decontaminate the soil, which
Which is difficult and
is
expensive.
difficult and expensive. Then the soil can be
Then the soil can be fertilized using biological waste.
fertilized using recycled biological waste. All of this will take a lot of time
All this will take a lot of time and it's very energy. It's
and it's very energy intensive. So we might use aquaponics to raise
So we might use aquaponics to raise fish and prawns together.
fish and plants together, making the astronauts' diets more
Making the astronauts' diet more varied and tasty at the same time.
varied and tasty at the same time. This will be an important psychological boost for our overwork
This would be an important physiological boost for our overworked crew.
crew. All of these things don't solve one fundamental problem
All these don't solve one fundamental problem though.
though. Mars has only 38% of Earth's
Mars only has 38% of the Earth's surface gravity,
surface gravity, which could cause muscle wasting
which should cause muscle wasting, bone loss, and cardiovascular problems.
bone loss and cardiovascular problems. While this might be solved
While this might be solved in the future by setting up rotationing living
in
space.
the future by setting up rotating living spaces, for now our crew has
For now, our crew has to live with low gravity
to live with low gravity and exercise a lot to slow
and exercise a lot to slow the degradation down.
the degradation down. The crews will probably have to rotate
The crew will probably have to rotate every few
every
years.
few years after being stuck indoors in tight spaces
After being stuck indoors in tight spaces without windows,
without windows, with the same people performing the
with the same people performing the same routines day in, day out,
same routines day in, day out, with little contact
with little contact from the
from the
outside world,
outside world and a lot to worry about.
a lot to worry
Like
about,
Antarctic side
like Antarctic science or submarine staffs.
Scientists or submarine staff, they will undergo intense
They will undergo intense physiological screening.
psychological screening to make sure they're mentally resilient
They make sure they're mentally resilient enough to handle this lifestyle for several years.
enough to handle this lifestyle for several years. Establishing the first real infrastructure on Mars
Establishing the first real infrastructure on Mars would be extremely taxing
will
work
be extremely taxing work
that only a group of very determined and competent people can do.
a group of very determined and competent people can do. Luckily, we have enough of these on Earth.
Luckily, we have enough of these on Earth.
And there you have it.
And there you have it.
A small Mars base that will survive for at least a few
A small Mars base that will survive for at least a few decades.
decades, as long as it's getting a constant supply of resources,
As long as it's getting a constant supply of resources,
parts, nuclear fuel,
nuclear fuel, and crews from
and
Earth.
crews from Earth. Unfortunately, Mars and Earth are separated by millions of kilometers,
Unfortunately, Mars and Earth are separated by millions of kilometers
and orbital periods that leave only a narrow travel window
and orbital periods that leave only a narrow travel window
every
into
2 years. If there's an emergency
If there's an emergency in the colony,
in the colony, Earth wouldn't be able to help until the next travel
Earth would be able to help until the next travel window opens.
opens. Helpers may arrive on a planet
Helpers might arrive on a planet filled with
filled with
corpses.
corpses. Settling Mars will be the toughest
Settling Mars will be the toughest challenge we have ever faced.
challenge we have ever faced. It will be gruesome work to establish
It'll be gruesome work to establish the infrastructure we
the
need,
infrastructure we need. But we're stubborn and we like
but we're stubborn and we like extreme challenges.
extreme challenges. If we push through phase 2 of
If we push through phase 2 of colonization, anything is possible.
colonization, anything is possible. Cities illuminating the
Cities illuminating the dark
dark
Martian
Martian
night,
night, a hub for travel between
a hub for travel between
the planets,
planets,
industries setting foot in orbit,
industry set foot, and terraforming a true multi-planetary future.
terraforming a true multi-planetary future. Going to Mars is
Going to Mars is hard, but worth
hard
it.
but worth it. And if we're lucky,
And if we are lucky, we might be around long enough to see it happening.
we might be around long enough to see it happening and cheer on the people
And cheer on the people who will take on these
who
challenges
take on these challenges for the benefit
for the benefit of us all.
of us all.
Thank you for watching my video. I hope you get a long day and study about Kurzgesagt. And Kurzgesagt is a collaborate with Brilliant. Thank you for watching my video. I hope you learned something today. If you do all the challenges, and it will benefit all the people, and one day you will be renamed a legend.